Mid woodland bowers, grassy dell, by enchanted murmuring stream, dwelt pretty blue-eyed Betsy Belle, sweetly thrilled with love's young dream. Life was like the magic spell that guides a laughing stream. Sunbeams glimmering on her fell, kissed by lunar's silvery gleam. But elfin phantoms cursed the dell, and sylvan witches all unseen, as our tale will truly tell, wielded scepter over the queen. In the year 1804, a man named John Bell and his family moved to a 320-acre farm in Red River, Tennessee, an area in Robertson County currently known as Adams. The unusual and unsettling events that would later transpire on this farm would become known as one of America's most famous and well-documented ghost stories. One that is still researched by scholars and paranormal enthusiasts alike, even today, over 200 years later. Today on Explaining Horrors, the series in which I, explain horrors, the title's pretty self-explanatory, I'm going to tell you the story of the Bell Witch. Now before we get into it, unlike pretty much every other website, book, and video about the Bell Witch, I am going to do you guys the courtesy of giving you a bit of a disclaimer. The legend of the Bell Witch is over 200 years old. That being said, as you can probably imagine, a lot of the details have likely been altered and lost in translation over time, like a spooky game of telephone. I spent a couple months pouring almost all of my free time into researching the Bell Witch, and I found that there are a lot of different variations of the events that took place on the Bell farm. There seems to be a lot of embellishments and unverifiable details in certain retellings of the story. That being said, I've done my best here today, after viewing every piece of Bell Witch information known to man, to sort through it all and provide you guys with the most accurate and full version of the story. The stories I am about to tell you come strictly from the most trusted sources on the happenings at the Bell farm. This includes compiled historical data and eyewitness accounts from members of the Bell family and other people from the Red River community. I'll elaborate more on these sources near the end of the video. But the disclaimer here is to take everything you hear about this story with a grain of salt. Because in truth, everyone who truly knows what happened on that farm has been dead for a long time, and much of it will forever remain a mystery. But let's not waste any more of your time. You came to hear something scary, and I intend to provide. The Bell family consisted of John, his wife Lucy, and their 9 children. Jesse, John Jr., Drury, who I'm going to call Drew because I hate saying the name Drury, Benjamin, who died as a child before the events of this story, Esther, Zadok, who also went off and died in Alabama, so forget about him, Elizabeth, who is referred to as Betsy, and their youngest children, Joel and Richard. John became a well-respected and influential member of the Red River community. He was an elder at the Red River Baptist Church and one of the wealthiest farmers in the area. The farm, mind you, was primarily tended to by the many people enslaved by the Bell family, which was unfortunately a common practice for wealthy farmers at the time. For 13 years, the Bell family farm was operating successfully without any strange occurrences, until the year 1817, when John Bell witnessed the first of many horrific sightings on the property. The story goes that one day in the summer of 1817, John was out inspecting his cornfield when he spotted a peculiar-looking animal sitting in the middle of one of the rows. The animal was described as being like a black dog, but with a very strange appearance. Upon closer inspection, John actually could not determine what type of animal the creature was. The appearance of this animal frightened John enough to fire at it with his shotgun, causing it to run off. He searched his cornfield but found nothing. No tracks, no evidence that the creature was even there to begin with. John thought nothing more of this at first, but it was only the beginning of the unexplained occurrences and the horror that would take place on the farm. Not too long after that, Betsy and Drew also saw strange, unrecognizable creatures on the property. Drew specifically seeing a very large bird perched on the fence that he at first thought was just a large fowl, but upon getting closer to it discovered that it was unlike any bird he had ever seen. But just like their father, they didn't really assign much importance to these sightings. Keep in mind that the country was still relatively new, and the state of Tennessee even newer, and therefore many of the animals in the area were unfamiliar to them, which is partly why these sightings were so easily written off. One day, around the same time as these other sightings, Betsy was outside when she saw what she believed to be a woman strolling through the orchard. She called out to the woman, but there was no answer, and then the figure just disappeared. Note also that in some versions of the story, it was not a woman, but rather a little girl dressed in green that was swinging to a limb of a tall oak tree. One evening, sometime after all of these sightings, the family started to hear strange noises around the house. It sounded as though someone was knocking on the windows and doors, something beating against the outside of their log home, and also the sound of wings flapping against the ceiling. John, thinking they were being pranked by someone from town, would rush outside to catch them in the act, only to find no one there, and no tracks around the house. On occasion, the entire house would even shake as if it were in a storm. John originally thought this to be earthquakes, but no one else in the area seemed to ever bring it up, leading him to believe that it was only his house that was troubled by this. This went on for several nights, and the Bell family's annoyance with these sounds soon turned into fear, as the knocking increased in frequency and was soon accompanied by other noises. In one room slept 4 of John's sons: Richard, John Jr., Drew, and Joel. One night in 1818, a year after John had seen the strange dog in his field, the 4 boys laying in their beds heard what sounded like rats gnawing at their bedposts. The oldest boys, Drew and John Jr., got out of their beds to kill the rat. However, as soon as they got up, the noises ceased. They checked under their beds and all around the room, but found no signs of a rat. They inspected their bedposts and found no damage at all. But as soon as they would get back in their beds, the noise would return. This went on for weeks, and during that time, the room was turned upside down on multiple occasions in search of the noise's source. But nothing was ever found, not even a crevice from which a rat could enter the room. Eventually, these noises would get more aggressive and much louder, almost as if a dog was clawing at the floor under the bed. But again, as soon as the boys would leap from their beds, the room would be silent. This was said to have happened not only in the boys' room, but also in the room of Betsy Bell. And from there, things only got worse. The children reported having their blankets pulled off of them in the middle of the night, and perhaps even more disturbing than the scratching and gnawing sounds, they would hear the sounds of someone gulping and choking, almost as if someone was being strangled in their room. These noises would keep the family awake every night until they would stop sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. Soon after, the family would begin hearing the sounds of large objects being dropped, furniture being pushed around, chairs falling over, chains dragging on the floor, and what was described as the sounds of fighting dogs chained together. No logical source was ever determined for any of the noises. The house was checked for rats and other animal infestations, but none were found. And the furniture, despite the sounds of gnawing, scratching, slamming, and dragging, was all completely undamaged. But disturbing noises were far from the family's only troubles. Soon these disturbances would become more physical and violent in nature, with a particular focus on Betsy Bell. Betsy would have her hair pulled, her face slapped, her body scratched, poked with what felt like a sewing needle, and even beaten and bruised, all by some invisible force. The people enslaved on the Bell farm were not safe from the torment either, as they too reported being tripped by something they couldn't see, and doors shutting and locking them out with no explanation. John Bell eventually had enough, and although he had been originally keeping their dilemma a secret, not only as a means to keep things quiet so they could catch a would-be prankster, but also so that John and his family would not become the subject of ridicule in town, John finally decided to tell someone about the disturbances. a trusted and close neighbor by the name of Mr. James Johnson. At John's request, Mr. Johnson and his wife came to the house to spend the night and investigate the mystery. That night, Mr. Johnson led the family in prayer and song, but almost as if to mock him, after they all went to sleep, the activity in the house was more aggressive than ever. Almost as if to show Mr. Johnson what it was capable of, all of the various disturbances were happening all at once. As soon as someone would get up to discover the source, the activity in that room would cease and move to another room. The bed covers were being ripped off of the family members with force, and Betsy was relentlessly and physically tormented all through the night. One retelling of this night states that a loud laughter could be heard throughout the house during the commotion. Mr. Johnson attempted to communicate with the entity causing the disturbances. He would ask who or what it was and what it wanted, and when he spoke to it, the activity would cease for a time before beginning again, leading Mr. Johnson and the Bell family to believe that there was indeed an intelligent force behind their horrific situation. It clearly understood when it was being spoken to. Mr. Johnson advised John Bell to invite other friends into the investigation, and in his desperation, he agreed. The haunting of the Bell family soon became public knowledge in Red River. However, instead of ridiculing the Bell family, the town came to their aid in full support. Committees were formed, experiments were done, and there was a constant watch being kept on the house and its ongoings, all in an effort to determine the reason behind these strange events. Despite this, however, the disturbances did not stop, nor did they get any closer to discovering its origins. In fact, the activity on the Bell property only increased in force, as if the entity they were now referring to as a witch was liking the attention. During that time, they would ask the witch questions, things like how many people are present and how many horses are in the barn, and it would answer by knocking or scratching the correct amount of times on the wall. Another thing said to have frequently occurred during this time was that the enslaved workers and the Bell family alike, when returning from late night work on the farm, would see flickering candle-like lights floating in the tree line and across the fields. And as they walked, stones and chunks of wood would fall near them, as if someone or something was throwing it at them, but they could never see where it came from. Almost everyone who found themselves on the property were being tormented by the witch, emotionally and physically. The family and their guests would be slapped, leaving red finger marks on their faces, have their hair pulled, and all sorts of physical abuse. But like I said, none of this was happening to anyone as often as it was happening to poor Betsy Bell, who, mind you, was only 12 years old when these disturbances began. The family would send Betsy, for her own safety, to the houses of various neighbors to stay the night. She stayed at the houses of James Johnson, John Johnson, Jessie Bell, Bennett Porter, and Thenny Thorne. But despite their efforts, the activity seemed to follow Betsy even off the property and into these other homes. As the investigations continued and people from the community kept poking around the property and attempting to speak with the witch, it eventually spoke back. It started by making low, broken whistling noises, almost as if it was trying to speak but could not. This soon progressed into weak, faltering whispers where distinct words could actually be made out, and soon enough, the Bell Witch found her voice. The spirit began to communicate with people in a clear, well-articulated voice, a voice that could be heard by everyone in the room. With this new development, people began to flock to the Bell property in larger numbers in hopes of hearing the voice of the Bell Witch. It is said that one night when asked again, "Who are you and what do you want?" the witch replied in a clear but feeble voice, "I am a spirit. I was once happy but have been disturbed." Now, from this point on, it's said that the witch would communicate with the Bell family and others on the property quite frequently, and oftentimes without being prompted. One story recounts a time when John Jr. was planning a trip up north to look after his father's share of an estate. As the family and a few neighbors discussed this trip, the witch suddenly decided to join their conversation. She warned John against going on the trip, telling him that the trip would be hard and that he would return empty-handed. She also went on to tell him that a wealthy young woman would be coming to town from Virginia that would please him, and that he could win her if he stayed in town. According to the account, John laughed at the witch's warning, thinking it to be supremely ridiculous, and went on his trip anyway, only to return 6 or so months later empty-handed, just as the witch had predicted. The young lady she had mentioned had also come to town and left before his return, and John never met her, proving that this spirit was powerful enough not only to speak, but also to predict the future. And this was not the only occurrence of that nature. There are multiple recollections given from farmhands and the visitors that during crop season, neighbors would often stop by the Bell property to ask the witch what the weather would be. A forecast she would always accurately predict. Frost, rain, snow, or sun, the witch was always a reliable source for upcoming weather. One story recounts a time when Betsy was going for a sleigh ride, a common activity among the local young people in the wintertime, and the witch told her, "Hold tight when we get to the corner." Sure enough, they flew around the corners with a speed that made it difficult to stay in the sleigh, causing them to hold on for dear life. There are more serious and dire prophecies told by the witch, but they will be discussed in future sections of the video where they will have more context. On one occasion, when once again being bombarded with prying questions, the witch claimed that she was the spirit of a person who was buried in the woods nearby. She said that her grave was disturbed and her bones were scattered, claiming that she was at the house to look for her missing tooth. Apparently, 3 to 4 years earlier, the farmhands, while clearing a plot of land, had discovered a small mound of graves which John Bell determined to be a Native American burial ground, and decided to work around them as opposed to disturbing them. However, several days later, a young man from the area named Corbin Hall was at the farm and was told about the graves by Drew Bell. Hall suggested that the Native Americans would often bury relics with their dead, and convinced Drew to help him dig them up to check. They found no relics in the graves. However, Hall did allegedly bring a jawbone into the house, and at some point threw it against a wall, knocking a tooth loose which fell through the floorboards. Remembering this incident, John Bell tore the floorboards up in hopes of finding the spirit's tooth, but was ultimately unsuccessful. The witch then laughed at John and claimed the whole thing to be a joke. Trickery of this manner became something not uncommon when interacting with the witch. On another occasion, the witch claimed to be a spirit of an early immigrant, and that she had buried treasure and a large sum of money in the area before her death. She described the exact location of the treasure in great detail, on the condition that the money would go solely to Betsy Bell. Drew Bell, Bennett Porter, and Mr. James Johnson labored away for half a day to move a very large rock and dig in the area, only to find nothing. That night, the witch's voice would manifest again, laughing at them and revealing that it was all a lie. Being very proud of this prank, it is said that the witch would describe the event to every newcomer in the house for a month afterward. One of the stranger things the witch was said to have done was to mimic sermons, sing hymns, recite Bible verses, and showcase a very thorough knowledge of the Bible and Christian faith. The first occurrence of a religious nature was a time when the witch repeated the prayers and song of Mr. James Johnson. The same prayers and song that he uttered the first night when he and his wife were invited over to investigate the disturbances. And even more disturbing, the witch was able to mimic his voice, so accurately that it seemed as though Mr. Johnson was in the room. Only he was not. From this time on, it became common for the witch to accurately quote Bible scripture and sing hymns, even going as far as to correct people in the house if they misquoted a verse during worship. It became a common test among visitors to open a Bible to any page and ask the witch to repeat a specific verse, which it would always do with great speed and flawless accuracy. It would also delight in debating those well-versed in scripture on various religious topics. One of the more famous events of a religious nature was a time when the witch mimicked a sermon from local Reverend James Gunn, followed immediately by a sermon from Reverend Sugg Fort. The strange thing about this was that these two sermons were happening at the same time, about 13 miles apart from each other, as confirmed later that evening when people gathered at the Bell Farm, as they often did, suggesting that the spirit could be in two places at once and could easily travel long distances, almost as if it had an omniscient stranglehold of the entire surrounding area. Even more proof of this came when the witch began to give nightly reports about all of the ongoings within the Red River area. It would tattle on people for their misdeeds and report anything of note during its many performances at the Bell Farm. It got to a point where the townsfolk would fear having their privacy invaded and their secrets revealed by the witch. One night, Lucy Bell was expressing worry about her son Jesse and his whereabouts after he had been on a trip and hadn't come to visit on the evening he was supposed to return home. According to the story, the witch spoke, telling Lucy to wait a minute and that it would go check on her son. Sure enough, a couple minutes later, the voice returned, reporting that Jesse Bell was safe at his home, reading a book by candlelight. Information that Jesse Bell would confirm when visiting the next morning. He claimed that during his reading he heard a knock at the door, and before he could get up to answer it, the door opened and quickly closed again. When asked by his wife what he thought it was, he stated that he reckoned it was the witch. This event would lead people to conversing with the witch more casually, and inquiring about the ongoings in certain places or houses in the area. However, the witch was not only confined to the Red River area. It is also said that she would visit the Bell family's old neighborhood in North Carolina, and return later to report the ongoings or news from that area. There is also a particularly baffling story about an Englishman who came to visit the Bell property. During his visit, the witch would keep him informed as to what was going on at his home in England, across the sea. Information that the man would learn to be true when he later received letters from home. The witch asked the man what he wanted to tell his family, saying that it would convey any message to them that he wished. The man told the witch to tell them that in his opinion, never since the world was created have men seen and heard the marvelous things I have witnessed during the past 3 months. 3 hours later, the voice returned, mimicking the voice of two people expressing astonishment at what was being told to them. One voice said, "Why, that is brother's voice. Where are you, brother?" The Englishman explained to John and John Jr., who were the only ones present at the time, that the two voices heard were that of his mother and brother, and that it sounded exactly like them. The spirit then repeated a message to him from his mother, saying, "Tell him not to stay any longer. He has heard and seen enough, and we do not want any more visits like that here." When the Englishman eventually arrived home in England, he wrote to John Jr. to tell him that all they had heard had been confirmed as true by his family, who was visited by the spirit. Despite the unbelievable amount of verbal communication from the spirit and its somewhat playful nature it occasionally displayed, its relentless mental and physical tormenting did not cease. The worst of which was directed towards John and their daughter Betsy, who the spirit made very clear that she did not like. Besides the physical torment, Betsy's love life was also disrupted by the witch. There was a young man named Joshua Gardner with whom Betsy was involved with, and the witch would warn Betsy against seeing him. She made her opposition to their relationship very clear and urged Betsy to sever her connection with him. The accounts claim that she would tell Betsy not to marry Joshua Gardner in a, quote, very strange voice. A voice that was described by Betsy as being unearthly. It would say embarrassing and private things about Betsy in the presence of Joshua and their friends. I suppose to deter Joshua from pursuing Betsy. This took a mental toll on Betsy and she became quite hysterical and exhausted. Joshua, however, did not falter. His love for Betsy was too great for the witch to scare him off, and he maintained the opinion that they should not allow the spirit to dictate their actions. Betsy, of course, feared the worst. She worried that the witch and its unseen powers would mean great danger for her and Joshua. This fear led them to postponing their marriage until they knew what the result might be, and eventually Betsy asked Joshua to release her from her promise to marry him, for the safety of them both, which he did with great disappointment, and the two of them never married. Joshua moved to Tennessee and they never saw each other again. Never did the witch reveal why she was so against their marriage. Betsy's afflictions grew worse as time went on. She became prone to fainting, experiencing smothering sensations, shortness of breath, and often rendered completely lifeless and exhausted despite otherwise being in perfect health. There was no evidence that these spells were caused by the witch, and no gloating or mention of it from the spirit itself, but they could find no other reason for it. Moreover, these things would happen to Betsy around the same time that the witch would usually make an appearance, and she wouldn't begin to speak until Betsy returned to normal, making it pretty clear that she had a hand in it. Eventually, however, these symptoms vanished from Betsy entirely, and she would never be afflicted by them again. John, on the other hand, was experiencing different afflictions that would never cease. He would complain of his tongue being numb and his jaw being stiff. This would eventually progress into swelling of the tongue, pressing against his jaw so that he could not eat or speak for many hours at a time. The witch would often mock John and say vile things about him, declaring that she would torment him to the end of his days. However, not once did she ever say why. She never spoke ill of John's character or tried to convince anyone else that he should be hated. She only ever proclaimed her hatred of him without providing any reason. He later developed some more serious problems. His face would begin to twitch and contort. It was described as a dancing of the flesh, and this affliction would apparently leave John bedridden for long periods of time. Now, you may be wondering, why didn't they just move far away? Well, the question of moving was in fact discussed. However, the witch declared that it would follow John, or Old Jack as she often referred to him, to the remotest part of the earth, and he believed it was not a bluff. As far as John was concerned, there was no escape. The question of who the Bell Witch was continued to plague the minds of everyone in Red River. They asked the spirit this question constantly, and when it did answer, it was always misleading or evasive, giving multiple different explanations. When this question was asked by Mr. John Johnston, it answered, "I am a spirit from everywhere. Heaven, hell, the earth. I am in the air, in houses, in any place at any time. Have been created millions of years. That is all I will tell you, Mr. Johnston." This response makes the witch seem like some sort of god. However, it's unclear whether or not it was just another one of her many fabricated origins. It wasn't until Reverend James Gunn asked that the witch decided to give them an answer she claimed to be the actual truth, declaring that Brother Gunn had asked in such a way that the answer could no longer be evaded. The spirit claimed that it was nobody and nothing but old Kate Bat's witch, and that she was determined to torment John Bell to death. Of course, this could very well have been another one of the spirit's lies, but many of the people in Red River seem to have believed it. Kate Batts was a very strange woman who many of the townsfolk already shunned and did not like. She was labeled as being eccentric and sensitive. Her husband, Frederick Batts, had become disabled, leaving Kate to become the head of the family and take charge of her husband's affairs, and her children had all died at very young ages, all of which likely did not help the witch accusations. However, some accounts describe her children as young adults, so the timeline of their deaths is a bit confusing. The superstitious also believed her to be a witch because of the way she would beg other women for their brass pins. The theory was that when someone would donate their brass pin to Kate, it would give her power over them. Also, the witch would often torment Betsy and others with the feeling of being poked by pins, and brass pins just like the ones she would often ask people for were found at the Bell house, sticking out of the pillows or on chairs. So naturally, people came to the conclusion that she was in some way connected to the witch. On top of the superstitions, Mrs. Batts was known to have always spoken harshly of John Bell over a dispute she had with him years earlier when the Bells had just moved to the settlement, over some kind of transaction. declaring that she would get even with him. When Kate found out about the accusations, she was very upset and denied any involvement with the haunting at the Bell property. It's worth noting that some of the people who gave accounts of Mrs. Batts remembered her as an odd lady, but also one that was very kind and funny, and very much loved by the children in the community. Everyone agreed that she was a strange woman, but not everyone disliked her for it. In fact, John Bell himself did not believe Kate Batts to be responsible or even capable of the torment he and his family were experiencing. The witch from that point on, however, seemed to have stuck with this narrative, always referring to itself as Kate and readily answering to that name when someone spoke to her. While the accusations towards Kate were flimsy at best, there are a couple strange occurrences that make it all a bit more convincing. First of all, a girl named Emily Payne was churning butter one morning, but she was in a rush and it was coming much too slowly. When her patience gave out, she said that she just knew that old Kate Batts had bewitched the milk, and that she was going to burn her for it. Emily took a heated iron poker from the fire and stuck it down the churn, believing that it would burn Kate Batts. Determined to prove it, she had made some excuse to visit Kate, and when she arrived, Kate was nursing a sore hand that she claimed to have burnt that morning. As far as Emily Payne was concerned, this confirmed her suspicions beyond a doubt. The other strange event took place after the death of Kate Batts. Back then, it was customary to sit up with the corpse for one night before the burial. Basically, the community would bring food and people would just sit there by the coffin sharing stories, singing, grieving, and remembering the dead. However, when Kate Batts died, it was difficult to find anybody that wanted to do this. She had no family and no friends. Eventually, however, a girl by the name of Fanny Story volunteered to pay her respects for the night, on the condition that 3 or 4 other girls would stay there with her. And so a group was formed to stay up with the body of Kate Batts. The next morning, the girls claimed that they had been troubled by black dogs and cats for the entire night, claiming that when 2 of the girls went to get fresh water from the well, they had to fight off dogs with sticks the entire way. They said that the yard was full of these large black curly-haired dogs, while the house was full of black cats jumping on the coffin. It's believed, however, that the girls may have been exaggerating or making up stories to play on people's superstitions. And the amount of cats and dogs, if there were any, it was probably only a few, as cats and dogs were plentiful at any place in the community. Now, Kate Batts died long after the hauntings had already ended, so while most consider it doubtful that she was actually involved, there is no way to really know. The next development in the haunting came with the introduction of 4 different voices. The witch would apparently pretend to be 4 different characters. One called Black Dog with the harsh voice of a woman, 2 called Mathematics and Typography who had soft feminine voices, and 1 called Jerusalem with the voice of a young boy. It would apparently torment the family and their company relentlessly with these 4 voices for some time, often arguing with each other and using the most vile of language. The voice known as Black Dog seemed to act as an authoritative mother-like figure towards the others, often breaking up their quarrels, cursing them and offering threats of murder if they did not desist their belligerent behavior. At times, it sounded as though Black Dog would mercilessly beat and thrash Jerusalem around for disobeying her. At the end of these strange performances, Black Dog would disperse the family of voices by sending them on different errands of deviltry. 1 or 2 of them would usually stay behind to keep up the disturbances in the house. On one occasion, these voices all sounded very drunk, and it was said that the whole house smelled of whiskey. It wasn't always a negative experience, however, as sometimes, instead of arguing, the voices would sing songs together that were reportedly very pleasant to hear. Eventually, however, the spirit dropped this act and returned to calling itself Kate, with no explanation ever given for the demonic array of voices. Now, like I said, the Bell family and their friends were not the only ones on the property being tormented by the witch. The witch apparently made it very clear that she did not like the people enslaved on the farm either. often speaking very harshly about them with many racist remarks. And the feeling was mutual. The enslaved workers would make sure to stay indoors after dark to avoid all possible contact with the spirit. She never bothered them in their cabins because, as she would state, she did not like their scent. While away from their quarters, however, they were not safe from the witch's torment. It is said that the witch would interrupt and torment them during their baptism ceremonies by the creek, telling them not to forget that they had been baptized and that they had better not ever commit sin. The voice would proclaim that if she sees someone come to get baptized again, she would drown them in the river. There are a few specific accounts of the witch's interactions with the farmhands, the most famous of these coming from a man named Dean. Dean claimed to have come into contact with the witch several times while working on the property. In his descriptions, he says that the witch often appeared as a black dog, sometimes just a regular black dog, but other times a dog with 2 heads, or even with no head, and that it would stalk him around the property and attack him. One story recounts a time in which Dean was attacked, and in defense he had split the dog's head down the center with his axe, which is believed to be why the next time he saw it, it had 2 heads. Dean was well known in the Red River community as the best axeman the country had ever seen. It's stated that his strength and ability to chop down trees was equal to that of at least 2 men doing the same job, a distinction that he was quite proud of. However, because of his frequent run-ins with the witch, he always carried his axe with him even when not on the job. That and a witch ball, which is usually a glass sphere said to ward off witches and evil spirits. However, according to the stories, Dean carried a different kind of witch ball that was actually made for him by his wife, using her own hair and various other spiritual ingredients. There is a particularly crazy story about Dean in which he was walking on the property and was again approached by the witch in the form of a black 2-headed dog. This time, it spoke to him, saying, "Dean, you can't pass here unless you give me that ball in your pocket." Dean, feeling confident that the witch ball would protect him, replied by asking the witch what its name was. She replied, "My name is Black Dog. You know me 'cause you split my head with your axe." He then told the witch that he had no ball in his pocket. She immediately called his bluff, saying, "You're a liar, Dean. You know you have a ball in your pocket." And he said that if the witch would not let him pass, he would simply go back the way he came. Dean turned around and walked the other direction, only to find the same dog stood in his path again. Seeing no other way out of the situation, he held his axe with intention to fight. The witch told him that if he did not give her the ball in his pocket, she would turn him into a mule and ride him over the river to the still house. Dean believed that if he gave her the ball, he would surely be dead, and so he told the witch that she wasn't going to have it, and that he would split her clean open to her tail if she didn't get out of his way. Suddenly, Dean felt weak, as if some sort of spell had come over him, and he dropped his axe on the ground. He recounts that in that moment, he heard a voice in his head telling him to pick up his axe. Dean got down on his hands and knees, feeling for the axe in the darkness, when suddenly he realized he could no longer get up. He then heard voices arguing, one saying that he's too high, to which the other replied, "Level him down." He then felt something tug on his tail. Yes, his tail. Dean had been literally turned into a mule. He then heard the voices arguing about who was going to get to ride up front and who had to sit on the back, until he felt 2 people climb onto his back. He referred to them in the story as the Big Witch and the Little Witch. The big one sat up front and grabbed him by the ears. He immediately jumped back and kicked them off, clean over his head, and took off running, hopping a fence and not stopping until he got to his wife's cabin. He said that he pawed at the door until she opened it, and upon seeing her, he returned to his normal self. In another story, Dean had desired to go hunting for possums in the nearby woods, something he quite enjoyed doing because not only was he a great possum hunter, but he also had an appetite for possums and taters. He worried, however, about encountering the witch, and the issue was that he could not bring the witch ball hunting as he believed the dogs would not be able to trail a possum after catching the scent of the witch ball. However, Dean had a plan. When he heard the witch's voice making its usual performance at the Bell House for its many visitors, Dean decided to take that opportunity to go for a quick hunt, before she had finished speaking with the guests for the night. So he took the dog, Caesar, and they headed out. The next morning, Dean was missing, and for a time, John Bell was quite worried. After breakfast, however, Dean showed up, sporting a large bloody gash on his head. John asked Dean what had happened, and he told him that the witch appeared to him in the form of a very large rabbit. She was apparently displeased about the methods Dean was using to hunt possum, and so she hit him over the head with a stick. He was knocked out and woke up the next morning. Dean sported this scar on his head for the remainder of his life, and never once claimed that it was from anything other than his run-in with the witch. The truth of Dean's stories, however, were always in question, as he was known to have a very vivid imagination. However, given what we've heard already, it doesn't sound much less believable than any of the other stories. His accounts were also corroborated by another farmhand by the name of Willis, who recalled Dean returning from his visits with his wife, who lived on Reverend Thomas Gunn's property, and his clothing was almost completely torn off, looking as though he had been thoroughly beaten. Another boy by the name of Harry was on a few occasions late to his duties, which was to cut wood and kindle the fires. John simply gave him a scolding, however, the witch was not so kind. Immediately after John was done lecturing the boy, the witch apparently took matters into her own hands, and Harry was picked up by the neck, flailed around mercilessly, and beaten with what sounded like a paddle or a strip of wood. However, nothing of the sort was visible to John or Harry. Another version of this story says that it was kindling from the fire that rose up to beat him. The witch told Harry that if he were ever late again, he would be beaten to death and thrown in the fire. Needless to say, he was never late again. There is another story about a 12-year-old girl named Phyllis who assisted Lucy Bell in the kitchen in the house. She had seen a group of other children doing gymnastic exercises attempting to lock their heels behind their necks. The next day, Phyllis, wanting to attempt this feat herself, hid upstairs to try it without getting in trouble. After several unsuccessful attempts, her feet were suddenly forced behind her head and locked in place by an invisible force. Her mother called for her over and over, and she answered from upstairs but could not move to come down. Her mother punished her severely with a switch before she could explain that the witch had been holding her in place. On another occasion, Lucy Bell, in an attempt to test the witch, hid a girl named Anki in her bedroom under the bed. She had promised Anki that the witch would be too busy entertaining the guests to notice her, but that was not the case. The witch was furious, screaming that they had to get the girl out of the house immediately, along with some other remarks that I won't repeat. From under the bed where Anki was hiding came noises like someone was hawking and spitting. Anki rolled out from under the bed, her head covered in what looked like white foam from spit, screaming that the witch was going to spit her to death. She ran out of the house and back to her cabin. The witch later said that if it had been anyone other than Lucy that brought Anki in the house, she would have killed the girl. During all of the excitement, there were many people that would come from out of town to witness these otherworldly occurrences. Some of these people came with the intention of solving the mystery of the witch, believing their intelligence to be greater than that of the spirit or those who might be behind it. One such man was a professional detective by the name of Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams had heard much about the Bell Witch mystery and was certain that he could debunk the disturbances as something the family was doing in order to profit in some way. It's worth noting that according to Richard Bell, the family never profited in any way from the many visitors frequenting their property. He states that they stayed as long as they liked and enjoyed his father's hospitality without paying a cent. John and Lucy would allow no one to go hungry, and would even make sure that their horses were fed before they departed. Many offered to pay them, but John would always refuse to take any payment. Anyways, for the first night of Mr. Williams' stay, the witch remained silent besides the occasional knock or scratch on the wall. Mr. Williams believed that the ones behind the witch were too afraid to make any larger displays while he was around, in fear of being exposed by the brilliant detective. The next night, Mr. Williams and several other visitors waited eagerly to hear the witch's voice, but again, there was nothing. The detective believed that this confirmed his suspicions, and he announced it to the rest of the visitors. That is, until they all went to sleep that night. Mr. Williams, sleeping on a straw mattress on the floor, suddenly found himself pinned down and unable to lift himself up, as if some invisible force were pushing down on him with great strength. He was then viciously beaten by this same invisible force, scratching and pounding on him until he screamed for help. The witch stopped for a moment only to ask Mr. Williams which one of the family members he thought was doing this, and then continued to beat the man mercilessly. When the lights came on from the commotion, the beating ceased. Mr. Williams did not sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, he sat there on a chair with a candle lit beside him, listening to the witch's voice mock him and his investigation for the rest of the night, asking him who he thought was behind this, how long he planned to stay, and all sorts of obviously sarcastic questions to ridicule the man. In the morning, he left as soon as the sun came up and could not even be convinced to stay for breakfast. Many men similar to Mr. Williams came to the house confident in their ability to expose or exorcise the witch, only to leave in fear or with some sort of grief. Another notable visitor of this nature was a famous magician and conjurer from Simpson County, Kentucky, known as Dr. Mize. John's condition was worsening, and the witch's language towards him was becoming far more violent and aggressive. He was urged by his friends to send for Dr. Mize, and despite his reservations, he finally agreed, desperate to rid his family of this cursed spirit. Dr. Mize arrived very confident, boasting about his skill in casting out devils and spirits. For 3 or 4 days, he stayed at the Bell house, with not a single word or noise from the witch. He found an old shotgun in the house and claimed that the witch had put a spell on it. He cleaned the gun and performed some sort of conjuration. He believed that because of that and the fact that there were no signs of the witch, that she would not be returning. He claimed that witches were always shy of him. He continued performing incantations and mixing random concoctions when suddenly the witch spoke. She questioned him as to what he was doing. He was at first unfazed by the voice coming from nowhere, telling it that a witch had no business prying into his affairs. But the witch did not stop pestering Dr. Mize. She began to question his methods, telling him that important ingredients were missing from his charms and making him out to be a fraud. She then started cursing him, speaking the most evil of threats in a long string of vile language. Dr. Mize became terrified, stating that that thing knows more about witchcraft than he did, and that he could do nothing with it. He arranged to leave early the next morning, but his horse would not cooperate. The witch then spoke to him again, proposing that she would make the horse go and accompany the doctor back to his home. Suddenly, the horse began to snort and kick before rushing away at full speed, while Dr. Mize held on for dear life. It was said that later that night, when the witch spoke to those in the house, she would tell them about her trip with Dr. Mize and the many tricks she played on him along the way. It was reported by many of the investigators that the witch's voice would follow them for a portion of their trips home, mocking them by giving advice on the subject of witches and inviting them back to solve the mystery. A story passed down from Betsy's friend Thenny Thorne tells of another time when an unnamed witch doctor had come, insisting that he could relieve Betsy of her torment if she took his medicine. And Betsy took it, claiming that she was willing to take anything, even if it was poison, to rid herself of the witch's afflictions. Soon after taking it, she was deathly sick, but the witch doctor assured them that this was to be expected. Betsy then vomited, and upon closer inspection, it was revealed that her vomit was full of pins and needles. And I mean this literally, she puked pins and needles. The witch then laughed and told the witch doctor that he was the only conjurer who had actually done a good job, because he made Betsy throw up enough pins and needles to supply the whole community, and that if he would give her another dose, he would have enough to set up a store, clearly mocking yet another failed attempt to stifle her efforts. According to Thenny Thorne's daughter-in-law, Thenny had actually gathered some of these brass pins and needles and kept them for the rest of her life. Many people tried to debunk the witch as a hoax, and all of them failed. There were many who suggested that the witch's voice was actually ventriloquism, done by a member of the family, oftentimes accusing Betsy. This theory, however, was debunked when John Jr. had a doctor cover Betsy's mouth while the witch was talking, and the talking did not cease. One of the strangest things about the witch's interactions with people from out of town is that despite nobody in the area having met these people before, the witch somehow knew everything about them. There is one account that tells of 4 men who arrived at the Bell farm from out of town. Before these men had a chance to introduce themselves, the witch announced one by name, saying that, quote, "He is a grand rascal who stole his wife. He pulled her out of her father's house through a window and hurt her arm, making her cry. Then he whispered to her, 'Hush, honey, don't cry. It will soon get well.'" Before leaving, the man was asked if what the witch had said was true, and he confirmed that the event happened just as she described. Somehow, the witch was able to see events that occurred in the past many miles away, as if she could peer into the thoughts and memories of anyone around her. In fact, in the accounts of Betsy, she states that the thoughts of visitors and neighbors alike were often revealed during the witch's performances. There were no secrets that could be kept from the spirit. There were also traders that often passed through the Bell property called the Shakers. They would often stop at the Bell house for a meal and a place to stay while traveling their routes. One night, after one of the house workers announced that the Shakers were coming up the road, the witch's voice suddenly spoke up, claiming that the Shakers would not be stopping at the house this time. Now, there were 3 large dogs that the Bells had on the property, looked after and trained very well by the farmhand Harry. They would listen to Harry's every command, but that night they did something completely out of the ordinary. When the Shakers got near the property, the witch's voice called for the dogs. "Here Caesar, here Tiger, here Bulger, sick, sick." The dogs, as if suddenly possessed, viciously barked at and chased after the Shakers. Harry tried to call them back, but no matter what he said, the dogs would not listen. The Shakers rode off to escape the dogs and never stopped at the property that night. Yet another prank that the witch would retell for nights to come to other visitors at the house. There is also a story I found interesting from the account of one Mr. William Wall. Mr. Wall lived in Montgomery County, and after hearing the tales of the Bell Witch, he decided he would make the journey to the Bell's farm to see these mysterious disturbances for himself. And so he traveled there by horseback. When he was approaching the property, he came to a stop upon hearing a voice calling him from the nearby bushes. The voice said, "Hello, Billy Wall. You are going to see the witch?" He was unable to see anyone, but Mr. Wall replied anyway, "Yes, that is where I am going." Then the voice said, "I am going there too, and I believe I will ride behind you on that fat horse." "All right," Mr. Wall replied, "hop up." At that moment, he felt his horse squat, as if some heavy weight had fallen on it, and it then began wriggling, prancing, and kicking up. Mr. Wall reached behind him to feel what it was, but felt nothing. However, he did continue to hear the voice as if it was right behind him. He claimed that the entire rest of the way to the Bell house, the voice was asking him all sorts of questions, complimenting his hair and laughing about his big fat horse. Once he arrived at the house, the voice invited him inside, telling him to hitch his horse and go on in, saying, "I will be in pretty soon to entertain you." Mr. Wall recounts that about an hour later, the witch's performance commenced with a loud rattling sound, as if hazelnuts were pouring down by showers onto the floor, followed by all sorts of talking. He says that the trip had completely satisfied his curiosity, and that he had had enough of the witch in just one night, and never returned. Now, there are a few other stories of different visitors that came to the house, but none really add much more value to the topic. Things like a man convincing the witch to shake hands with her and the man feeling her hand in his. Or how she injured a man by causing his horse to kick and buck until he fell off. But those stories aside, perhaps the most important visitor from out of town was General Andrew Jackson. Those of you who know your American history might recognize the name. Yes, the Andrew Jackson I speak of is the very same Andrew Jackson that would become the 7th President of the United States in 1829. Interested in the strange ongoings at the Bell Farm, General Jackson and his party traveled there on horseback with a wagon loaded with a tent and other camping supplies, as they intended to camp outside as opposed to taking up space inside the home, where Jackson knew there would likely already be many visitors. When the wagon was just a short distance from the Bell Farm, it suddenly came to a stop. The driver was unable to make the horses move, no matter how much he yelled and whipped them, or how hard the horses appeared to be trying to pull it. The wagon would not budge. General Jackson and his men attempted to push the wagon themselves, but had no more luck than the horses did. They examined the wagon and could find no reason why the horses would not be able to pull it. They were on level ground with no obstructions in their path. The driver tried again to make the horses go, but still the wagon was immovable. General Jackson shouted after a few minutes of thought, "It is the witch." And almost as if in response to this, a voice called from the roadside saying, "They can go now, General." Neither Jackson nor his men could see anyone on the side of the road, yet they had all distinctly heard the voice, and the horses could once again move the wagon. After this ordeal, General Jackson is quoted saying that dealing with the witch was worse than fighting the British. That night, the general and his men were entertained in the Bell home with dinner and stories. Within this group was a man who claimed to be a, quote, real witch tamer, and he believed that no witch would appear while he was present. He claimed that his pistol was loaded with a silver bullet and that he wanted to try it out on the witch. This man prattled on all night about his many adventures and tales of him overcoming witches. But General Jackson was growing impatient, having not heard from the witch since their wagon was stopped earlier, and the man with the silver bullet finally dared the witch to reveal herself. Suddenly, the man shot up from his chair and shouted, "Boys, I am being stuck by 1,000 pins." The witch's voice then spoke, "I am in front of you. Shoot," daring the man to shoot his silver bullet. He drew his pistol, but it would not fire. The witch then spoke again, "It's my night for fun." Immediately after this, the man was slapped in the jaw by an invisible force, and he started yelling, "It's pulling off my nose." He ran for the door, which flew open on its own, and he ran all the way to the wagon, shouting in pain the whole way. The account claims that the witch gave him advice the entire way to the wagon, but it does not elaborate on what that advice was. Presumably advice on the subject of witches, as she did with many would-be challengers. This display brought great joy to General Jackson. He laughed and told John Bell that he had never seen or heard anything so funny and mysterious, and that he would like to stay for an entire week. The witch spoke up again, this time addressing Jackson, and she said, "There is another fraud in your party, General. I'll get him tomorrow night. It's getting late, go to bed." The rest of Jackson's party could not be convinced to stay another night after hearing the witch's warning, not knowing which of them would be the next victim. Despite Jackson wanting to stay, he and his party left the next day, and they never returned. Now, this is a story that for whatever reason I find creepier than the others. It centers around a member of the Bell family I haven't spoke much about yet, Esther Bell. You see, one day, Esther was on her way to gather some eggs from the hens located just across the road from the house. As she crossed the road, she saw a woman walking up it towards the property. She quickly gathered up the eggs just in time to meet the lady at the front entrance. She thought she had recognized the woman as one of the neighbors and greeted her pleasantly, but the woman did not reply. She just kept walking towards the house. Esther, thinking that maybe she just didn't hear her, repeated herself. But again, the woman did not respond. The woman then took off her bonnet, let her hair down, and began to comb through her hair with her fingers. She stopped walking just opposite of the house and continued to comb at her hair, almost nervously and aggressively, as if she was troubled or deeply lost in some disturbing thought. Esther invited the woman to come inside the house, but it was like she couldn't even see or hear her. She just stood there combing her hair. Esther felt a bit disturbed and humiliated by the woman at this point, and she went inside the house. She called Betsy over to look out the window at the strange woman. They watched as the woman climbed onto the yard fence and sat there for another 5 minutes just combing through her hair. They then watched as she left the fence and walked around the side of the house towards the stable area. In this lot, there was a group of small saplings and a large log laying on the ground. The woman walked across the lot and passed around the log, when suddenly 3 other people appeared to be walking with her, 2 young girls and a little boy. The 4 of them then did something very strange. They each climbed onto one of the saplings and started to sway back and forth. As the girls watched in horror, Bennett Porter arrived at the house, and they called him over to see the eerie display taking place outside. They pointed at the swaying trees, but Bennett could not see any people in them, just the saplings swaying back and forth. Bennett decided that these apparitions were likely the witch's doing, and he got his gun, suggesting that Esther should shoot at one of them. While he was getting his gun, the apparitions climbed down from the trees and hid behind the log, each one of them poking their head up from behind it one by one. Esther did not want to shoot, but she pointed to a knot in the log where one of the heads appeared, and Bennett shot. His bullet hit the log, and the apparitions were then nowhere to be seen. That night, the witch was once again speaking in her 4 voices, and during the performance mentioned that Bennett Porter had shot Jerusalem and broke his arm with the bullet. So it seems as though the woman and the 3 children that appeared to Esther and Betsy were also the 4 voices that the witch occasionally conjured up. Another man by the name of William Porter apparently spoke to the witch quite often. He was not afraid of her, and the witch seemed to take a liking to him. He told the Bells a story about the witch visiting his own home one night. He claimed to be in bed on a cold night with his fireplace lit. He had heard scratching and thumping on the bed, and he recognized it as the same disturbances heard in the Bell house. Suddenly, he heard a voice, unmistakably the voice of the witch. She said to him, "Billy, I have come to sleep with you and keep you warm." He jokingly replied that she must behave herself, but was soon filled with a feeling of fear as he felt a chilling sensation and something snake-like crawling on the bed. The covers were slowly pulled from Mr. Porter and rolled up as if someone had taken his bed sheets and wrapped themselves in it. The thought then struck him that he had the witch captured, and that he could throw her into the fire to burn her away. He quickly grabbed the mass wrapped in the covers to throw it in the fire. However, it was much heavier than he had expected, and it smelled awful. He said that he didn't even get halfway across the room with it before the odor and the weight became too much for him to bear, causing him to drop it and run from the room. After he had collected himself, he returned to the room to find the bed sheets laying on the floor without a mass in them, and the stench completely gone. On the river near the north boundary of the farm, there is a cave. At the front of the cave was a space where people would often hang out and have lunch, and below the cave made a good spot for fishing in the river. In present day, this cave is now known as the famous Bell Witch Cave. However, according to Betsy Bell, no one ever thought of the cave as a place that the spirit occupied. On their trips, however, she said that they did hear the voice of the witch coming from the cave, or sometimes from the river. Betsy and her friends would often explore the cave by candlelight. The cave went quite a ways back and led to a big space with about a 30-foot high ceiling. Beyond this point, the passage becomes very small. A story told by Betsy claims that one time while exploring the cave, one of the boys came to a tunnel that was so small he had to get down on his knees to crawl into it. When he did this, he crawled into some kind of mud or quicksand deposit and became stuck. His candle went out and no one was able to get to him. Betsy says that suddenly the entire cave lit up, as if from a big lamp, and the witch's voice called out, "I'll get you out." At that moment, the boy's legs were seized and he was pulled out, nearly suffocating as his face dragged through the mud. The children agreed to not tell the parents of this nearly fatal accident, but the witch apparently had other ideas. That night at the Bell farm, the witch asked the boy's parents if they had gotten all the mud out of his hair, telling them of the incident in the cave and advising them to put a halter on him next time so his companions could pull him out. Betsy also says that the spirit would play tricks on them while they were fishing near the cave. saying that she would allow them to have no success, but kept the corks bobbing so that they would jerk their lines up and find nothing on the hook. The witch would then laugh at them. The two youngest sons in the Bell family, Richard and Joel, were not immune from the witch's torment. Richard recounts that on their way to school, they had to walk through the woods, passing through some briar patches and hazel thickets. He said that when they passed by these thickets, sticks and rocks would be tossed at them from within. They were never tossed in a harmful manner, however, and so Joel and Richard would cut notches into the sticks and throw them back. Sure enough, the very same sticks would be hurled back at them. After dark, the witch would then recount everything that occurred during their walks to and from school, claiming that she appeared as a rabbit or something else at certain points on their walk. She would also take responsibility for any times that the boys would trip and fall. But while occasionally playful with the boys, there were other times where she was not so kind. Richard also recounts a story where Joel, after having enough of his bedsheets being pulled off and his hair being yanked, proceeded to kick and yell, calling the witch all sorts of awful things. And the witch then screamed at him, saying that she'll let him know who he's talking to before beating him into an almost lifeless state, only stopping when John came into the room to see what the commotion was about. Now, despite the various ways in which the witch would torment and harass the other family members, the mother, Lucy Bell, was completely free of these torments. On many occasions, the witch would state that, quote, "Old Luce was a good woman." In fact, the witch was very kind to Lucy and took great care of her when she fell ill. You see, in September of the year 1820, Lucy fell ill with a bad case of pleurisy. During this time, Lucy remained bedridden and the spirit stayed by her bedside through the entire course of her illness, constantly expressing how sad she was that Lucy was sick and asking her daily if she felt any better or if there was anything she could do to help. When anything was needed for Lucy's comfort, the witch would speak and tell everyone in attendance exactly where the item could be found. She would also sing songs for Lucy, which were reportedly the most beautiful sounds to ever fall upon their ears, according to all those in attendance. So beautiful, in fact, that it would cause Lucy and the visitors to cry. When Lucy lost her appetite, the spirit brought her hazelnuts from the nearby forest. The story claims that the witch's voice told Lucy to hold out her hands, and the hazelnuts fell into them from above. This was witnessed by several other women in the room, and the floor above was examined for some sort of hole that someone could have dropped hazelnuts through, but nothing was found. The same thing would occur with grapes as well. The witch had so much respect for Lucy that it would even tell her that she would never have cause to personally fear it. And in return for all the spirit's kindness, Lucy was always kind to it as well. However, she would also use this kindness to attempt to discover what exactly the spirit was. She would use every art she possessed to get the witch to tell her of itself, but it would not. It told her that if there was any human being in this world it would tell, it would be her, but even still, it would not. It did, however, provide Lucy with a very strange and ominous prophecy. It told her that it would return after many years, and that when it did, people would imagine themselves smart enough to comprehend what it was. The spirit laughed and said, "Luce, I wish you could be there and let yourself be known. Luce, you will see from where you are how this country develops. And with your great goodness, you will be sorely distressed at the way they have reached the position of envy to which they have climbed. Luce, I'll be there and you will be able to see what I do from where you are, and you will know exactly what I am and why I am there." It seems that the spirit was telling her that after she dies, she will be able to watch over things from the afterlife, and only then will Lucy know what the witch is and why it is there. It's interesting, though, that in this prophecy, the spirit speaks as if it were so much more than just a spirit. It speaks as though the next time it returns to our world, it will be to do something on a grander scale in response to the state of the world, and that Lucy Bell will see it then for what it truly is. It's also worth noting that, much like Lucy Bell, Jessie Bell's wife Martha was also treated kindly by the witch. When Jesse and Martha were preparing to move to Mississippi along with Bennett Porter and his family, the witch visited Martha one late afternoon. Martha was sitting outside peeling apples when she heard a buzzing or whispering in her ear, something she immediately recognized as the witch. She called out, "What do you want, Kate? Speak out so I can understand you." The witch then replied to her in a clear voice, saying that she has brought Martha a present to remember her by when they move to their faraway new home. She then asked if Martha would accept this gift. Martha replied that she would gladly accept any present the witch may bring. After this, a small roll neatly wrapped in paper fell on Martha's lap. She looked around and could see no one, nor could she determine where the item came from. Seeing that Martha was confused, the witch spoke up, saying, "I brought it, Potts." Potts being the nickname she often used for Martha. She then said, "See what a nice pair of stockings. I want you to keep them for your burial, to remember me, and never wear them." Martha tore the paper off the roll to discover a pair of elegant black silk stockings. She thanked the witch and promised to keep them as she requested. However, Martha was visibly concerned, staring at an ugly stain on the stockings. The witch noticed this as well and again spoke, saying, "That is blood. They killed a beef at Kate Batts this morning and the blood splattered on the stocking." This was all the witch said to Martha before departing, leaving Martha speechless and confused. It's unclear whether or not the witch stole the stockings from Kate Batts' house or not, but Jesse Bell, upon hearing of his wife's encounter, went over to Kate Batts' house and confirmed that they did indeed slaughter a cow that morning, and that it had been a very busy day at the Batts property, so no family members had left the house. So the source of the black stockings remains a mystery, but the story itself at least showcases the witch's friendly relationship with Martha Bell. So we've already been over a few of Betsy Bell's encounters with the witch, but I'm going to tell you more, because, well, there is more. Let's start with the first night Betsy was sent to a friend's house in an attempt to give her some peace away from the witch. Her first night away from home was spent with one of her best friends, Thenny Thorne. There was no sign of the witch at all until they retired to their beds. They securely locked the bedroom door and climbed into their beds, and just as soon as they did, a loud knocking was heard on the door, which seemed to fly open with a huge gust of wind blowing into the room. Their bedsheets were then pulled off of them and Thenny sprang up and lit a candle. To their surprise, however, the door remained shut. They gathered their sheets and laid back down in bed. A voice then spoke softly to them in the room, saying, "Betsy, you should not have come over here. You know I can follow you anywhere. Now get a good night's sleep." A soft hand then patted Betsy on the cheek, and the voice spoke again, saying that it would not disturb them anymore that night. Betsy was relieved to actually get a night where the witch would not disturb her sleep. The next morning, when Betsy and Thenny went back to the Bell house, Lucy informed them that the witch had spoken to her as well that night and told her of the encounter at Thenny's house, telling Lucy not to be alarmed and that the girls would rest well and return home the next day. Another story from Betsy recounts another outing with her friends in which they brought the dogs out to participate in a rabbit chase, another pastime they often enjoyed. They were in a field just east of the house when the dogs spotted a rabbit. The rabbit, instead of running off into the forest, took a circular route up to the top of a nearby hill and then back to the bottom, a course that it repeated 4 or 5 times, avoiding both the dogs and the kids until the dogs were too tired to chase it any longer. At that point, the rabbit ran off out of sight. That night, during the witch's usual performances, she revealed that she was the rabbit they had been chasing, and laughed at their inability to catch her. Betsy on another occasion went with some younger children to a nearby forest to pick spring blossoms to decorate for Easter Sunday. She returned home shortly after looking nervous and agitated, and her mother Lucy inquired about what had caused this. Betsy told her mother that while she was out there, she reached overhead to break off some flowers for the children, and she heard a voice speak to her saying, "Betsy Bell, don't break a flower. If you do, you will pay well for it." She then looked about 20 feet across a wagon road running through the woods, and she saw what she described as a ghostly-looking woman dressed in pale green suspended from the limb of a large red oak tree. She was holding it with both hands, and her frail body swayed back and forth in the air. She had hoped at first that her eyes were just playing tricks on her, but upon turning away and looking again, the woman was still there. She hurried the children to return home, and she watched them closely to see if any of them noticed the woman in the tree, but none of them could see it. Only Betsy. Betsy also tells a story where, at her birthday party, the witch surprised the ones in attendance with a basket of fruit. They watched as unseen hands placed the basket of fruit on the table, and then listened as the witch's voice proclaimed that these fruits were from the West Indies, and that she had brought them herself for the kids to enjoy. It is strange that despite the many accounts of the witch tormenting Betsy relentlessly, there are also ones like this where it seems the witch was kind to her. In fact, Betsy even recounts a story in which the spirit saved the lives of her and her friends. You see, one summer day, her and a couple friends were out riding horses on the north side of the farm near the bend of the river, when they suddenly found themselves caught in a terrible storm. Before they had left that day, Betsy claims that the witch had told them not to go because the storm was coming. However, she apparently said things like that frequently to scare them, so Betsy and her friends did not listen. Just as the storm had come, they heard the witch's voice telling them to cross the river as quickly as possible, or some of them would be killed. They attempted to follow the voice's instruction, however the horses refused to cross the river. The witch then called out again, "You little fools, hold tight now and say nothing to the horses." At that moment, the horses stopped freaking out and headed straight across the river and home to safety. Betsy claimed that she had no doubt that the witch saved their lives that day, as after the storm had passed, many of the large trees along the path they had been traveling had fallen over. Stories of the Bell Witch similar to this one paint a very strange relationship between the spirit and Betsy Bell. Because, as I explained earlier, tormenting Betsy was one of the witch's favorite pastimes, and it showed no care for her well-being on those occasions. There was a friend of John Jr.'s who was a friend of the family as a whole, named Frank Miles. According to Betsy's stories, he was the most powerful and fearless man any of them had ever known, but at the same time, very tender-hearted. Betsy recounts a story in which he told her to come sit next to him, saying, "I have come to give you a good rest. Nothing will bother you while I am here." This angered the witch quite a bit, seemingly taking Frank's word as a challenge to her power. It screamed at him, "You go home. You can do no good here." It then grabbed Betsy by the hair, yanked it so hard that her combs fell out, and pinched her cheeks until they were red. Frank went into a rage, swearing at the witch as it screamed back at him to mind his own affairs. Frank dared the witch to take any form that he could grab hold of, and it had warned him that it had slapped him before, and that if he wasn't careful, it would, quote, knock his block off. Frank apologized to Betsy for making a scene and told her that the witch was the biggest coward to visit this earth, to be torturing a child little more than a baby. He asked the spirit, "Why not work on me, you fiend of hell?" But Frank's taunts and efforts to protect Betsy were all in vain, as he soon learned that there was nothing he could do to sway the witch into leaving her alone. Betsy's overall thoughts on the witch, besides that of fear, was that she had no idea what the spirit was, and only thought of it as simply a supernatural being. She believed that the truth of it was far beyond her comprehension. So, as I've already discussed with the cases of Lucy and Martha, the witch did have respect for certain members of the family for whatever reason. And John Jr. was perhaps one of the strangest instances of this. He and the witch had a very unique relationship. You see, John Jr. was said to be a boy of great intellect, and his back and forth dialogue with the witch would always have her on the defensive. It is said that he would never restrain himself when communicating with the spirit, that he would speak to her with short, stern language, never at any time showing any fear, and always denouncing the spirit in abusive terms, referring to it as a spirit of the damned, and oftentimes even a demon. For his intellect and courage, the witch held some sort of respect for him that it held for nobody else who ever challenged it, and never physically abused him the way it did the other children. In fact, when John Jr. was around, it was said that the witch's treatment of Betsy would be less aggressive, and that she would refrain from saying anything too vile about her when he was present. John Jr. at one point during the hauntings told the witch that it should be ashamed, and that it was the most unjust being to ever have visited this earth, calling the spirit a coward for persecuting his young, innocent sister. He then invited the witch to direct her harm towards him instead, saying that he has no fear of her and to destroy him if she must, but that she will get no pleasure from it. He told the witch that when he leaves this earth, he hopes to have a better existence than hers, claiming that she is likely doomed to an everlasting condition of unhappiness. In response to this, the witch admitted that she did not really know why she did not punish John Jr. for speaking to her this way, but that something about the way he spoke to her gave her respect for him. Still though, she refused to bring harm to John Jr. in place of Betsy. She went on to say that even a monster as you think I am would like to speak to someone who is not so frightened or unintelligent, essentially telling John Jr. that she views him as someone who is brave and intelligent enough to converse with. Because of this, it is said that John Jr. knew more about the witch than any other member of the family, even Lucy, because she would tell him things that she would tell nobody else. For example, in response to John Jr.'s remark about the witch being doomed to an everlasting condition of happiness, she admitted to him that he is correct, stating, "I am not getting happiness in your world. I have no such thing, nor have I ever had. I do not deny my hope for a day of happiness passed hundreds of years ago." The witch told John that with him and his mother Lucy, she had been absolutely truthful, saying that he will never know of her telling him or his mother a lie. She told him that he may not understand everything she tells him, but that it would always be the truth. In John Jr.'s recollections, there are many different conversations with the witch that, for the sake of not boring you to death, I won't go over in full detail, but I will discuss some of the most important information. The first one of note is in regards to the witch's cruel treatment of his father, John Bell. When John Jr. questioned the witch about his father's illness, she would not say anything of any connection she may have had with it, nor would she promise to quit its cruel treatment of him, refusing to give any reason for it other than that someday some generation would benefit from it. She would also have many discussions of a religious nature with John Jr., speaking often about Jesus Christ and the Christian faith while in debate with John Jr. about her actions towards his family. In one such discussion, the witch actually speaks to John Jr. about the fall of the famous French ruler and military commander Napoleon, in the context of Christianity, showcasing a very thorough knowledge of not only biblical scripture, but also the history of the world, which further paints the picture of this entity being very old and almost all-knowing. Moreover, she also spoke to John Jr. of grave prophecies regarding the future of the world. She spoke about how world leaders had forgotten their professed allegiances to Christianity, and that they now seek only personal gain and to satisfy their ambitions. She said, quote, "I have witnessed the things I am telling you, and the final penalty will be terrible." She also told him that the president, who would have been James Monroe at the time, would place the Americas in a position of security before the end of his term. For many years of his life, John remained silent about the haunting. He never discussed it with anyone and never shared his encounters or conversations with the witch, not even with his brother Richard, who he knew had written about his own experiences. According to John Jr.'s grandson, he only spoke of the witch 3 times that he can remember, in which he relayed some of the information given in this video. Alright, so all the little stories aside, I believe it's time we move on to more important events. The first thing being the death of John Bell. So as I mentioned, John's afflictions were getting worse. The twitching of his face and the swelling of his tongue would leave him bedridden and unable to do anything for 1 or 2 days at a time. After they would pass, however, he would suddenly be in great health again, going about his business as normal. But these episodes would become more and more frequent as time went on, and with them the witch would become angrier and more hateful towards John, spewing heinous curses and threats at him constantly. In the middle of one October, John had a very severe attack which kept him confined to the house for several days. After overcoming it and recuperating for a week, he invited his son Richard to walk to the hog pen with him and assist him. While they walked, John's shoes continuously came flying off of his feet. Richard would replace them and tie them up for his father, only for it to happen again moments later. After finishing their work at the hog pens, they began to walk back to the house, and again his shoes began to be ripped off of his feet. John then complained about feeling a blow to his face, that he described as feeling like he was hit with an open hand. He sat down on a log to recollect himself, but his face once again began to twitch and contort. He attempted to put his shoes back on, but they would fly off just as soon as he could get them on. The two of them suddenly heard the sounds of shrieking and mocking laughter in the woods all around them. Richard looked at his father as the demonic shrieking faded away, and there were tears running down John's face. John was at his breaking point and could no longer put on a brave face for his family. He looked at Richard and said, "Oh, my son, not long will you have a father to wait on so patiently. I cannot much longer survive the persecutions of this terrible thing. It is killing me by slow tortures, and I feel that the end is nigh." These words sent a chill down Richard's spine, not ever before seeing his father in such a broken state. John got down on his knees and began to pray, more passionately than Richard had ever seen him pray before. He prayed to the Lord that, if it were possible, to let this terrible affliction pass. He asked for courage and faith and to relieve his family from all that this wicked entity was bringing them. After his prayer, a feeling of calmness seemed to wash over John, and his twitching episode had faded. They returned to the house, and although he was able to move around as usual for several weeks, John did not leave the house again. It seemed he had come to terms with some sort of terrible fate that awaited him. From that point on, John's health slowly declined. John Jr. recounts that he gave his father every single dose of every medicine that the doctor would leave, but it did nothing to help him. The witch told John Jr. that the medicine was of no use, and that she was going to kill his father. John's family and friends were often at his bedside on a daily basis at this time, until the morning of December 19th, 1820. John Bell did not wake up that morning as he usually did. He wasn't dead, but he was in a deep slumber that no one was able to wake him from. John Jr. decided to give his father some more medicine, but when he went to the cupboard where they had kept it, it was all gone. All that remained in the cupboard was a smoky-looking vial about 1/3 full of a dark-colored liquid, described by John Jr. as a brown fluid. Nobody could account for where the medicine went or what the vial of strange liquid was. They sent for a doctor to come see John, Dr. George Hobson of Port Royal. In the meantime, the witch began to speak again in a joyous voice, saying, "It's useless for you to try to relieve old Jack. I have got him this time. He will never get up from that bed again." They questioned the voice about the vial of liquid, to which she replied, "I put it there. I gave old Jack a big dose of it last night while he was asleep, which fixed him." This was all she would say. When the doctor arrived, he examined the vial but could not tell what the strange liquid inside was. Not to mention, he was the only doctor bringing medicine to the house. They decided to test the substance on a cat, putting a small amount on the cat's tongue. The cat jumped and rolled around frantically for a few moments, having convulsions, and died shortly after. I know. What the f***? Anyways, John continued to lay in his coma-like state all day and night. The doctor said that he could smell something on John's breath that matched the smell of the strange substance. It said that the vial was thrown into the fireplace and a burst of blue flames shot up the chimney. The next morning, December 20th, 1820, John Bell would breathe his last breath. The witch could be heard singing and rejoicing over John's death all throughout the house. At John's funeral, after the service was held, which was stated to be a massive affair with everyone in Red River and people from all over the country, the crowd could all hear the witch singing wild songs in celebration. It's worth noting that following the death of John Bell, the witch had completely stopped tormenting Betsy Bell, almost as if to show sympathy for the loss of her father. It would advise her mother Lucy to watch over Betsy and try to make her happy, and it would ask if it could bring her some rare delicacy to eat, which it often did. It would also tell Betsy tales of faraway places and of the lives of girls in different countries and other parts of America. Because of this new treatment, Betsy returned to her natural, cheerful self for some time. However, the torment would return when she and Joshua Gardner became more devoted to one another, a story we've already discussed. John Jr., of course, hated the spirit even more so than he did before, and in the winter following his father's death, he called the spirit out once again to condemn its treatment of his father and his unjust death. The spirit, as usual, spoke quite calmly to John Jr., saying, "John, your father sees each day what his children are doing, and is now at peace with the prospect of seeing your future happiness." John Jr. told the witch that he could not possibly be happy after seeing what she had done to his father, and also that no matter what she said to him, he would not see her in any other way than he does now. The witch wanted to, in some way, convince John Jr. that his father was at peace and watching over him. She said that she would speak in the voice of his father and tell him what his father would say to him, but that she knew he wouldn't believe that it was really him speaking even if she did that. In fact, she claimed that his father is beyond all of her power, or any other, except the Almighty Creator. She then told John Jr. to look out the window, pointing out that there were no tracks in the snow. She then said, "Now observe tracks being made approaching your window." John Jr. watched as the snow was disturbed as if someone were walking on it towards his window. Tracks formed that seemed to have been made by heavy boots. The witch then said, "If you have any doubts, take your father's old boots from the back porch and see if they fit those tracks." John Jr. refused to check, but he did not need to. The witch explained that it was impossible for his father to have made those tracks, or do anything else that some foolish people might believe. She wanted to demonstrate to John Jr. that she could trick people into believing that John Sr. was still around, or trying to contact them from beyond the grave, but she had no intention of doing any such thing. She then said to him, "When I bid you and your folks goodbye, I shall not be seen or heard again here until I show what I am doing on my return. Do not ever worry about me being here until that time. I shall not worry you or your people when I make my next visit to you." After the death of John Bell, the presence of the witch remained at the Bell farm all through the winter and spring of 1821, but slowly grew less and less active until eventually it said farewell to the Bell family. According to John Jr., one evening the family was sitting around the fireplace after supper, and a ball, something like a cannonball, rolled down the chimney and out into the room where it burst into smoke. The witch's voice then spoke out, "I am going and will be gone for 7 years. Goodbye to all." Note that in Richard's version of this story, this was something just said to Lucy Bell and not the entire family, but John Jr. seems to have remembered it differently. Either way, the spirit made it clear that it would be leaving, but that it would return in 7 years' time. And it did, in February of 1828. The Bell family was mostly broken apart and scattered by then, with many of the family having moved out and settled elsewhere on their own. The only remaining family members living at the old farm were Lucy and her sons Richard and Joel. One night, disturbances similar to the witch's first appearance began to happen again. It started with the knocking sounds on the house and progressed into the gnawing and scratching of the bedposts, and finally the pulling off of blankets in the middle of the night. The family agreed that this was likely the witch having returned, and decided that this time they would ignore it and not speak a word about it in the hopes that she would just go away. And she did. After 2 weeks of these disturbances, the witch never bothered them again. Also in 1828, however, an account from John Bell Jr. states that the witch also visited his home and spoke to him. It was March of 1828, which would have been just after the witch's short return to the Bell home the month prior. He claims that the spirit came without warning one evening while he was reading. In the same voice that he had become very familiar with 7 years before, the witch said, "John, I am in hopes that you will not be as angry at me on this visit as you were on my last. I shall do nothing to cause you offense. I have been in the West Indies for 7 years. Note that this is the second time the witch had mentioned going to the West Indies. For those of you who don't know, this is the North American grouping of islands east of Mexico and south of Florida that contains Cuba, the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, etc. Why the witch seemed so obsessed with that area is unknown, but it makes me wonder if there were people there that she was visiting in the same way she visited the Bell family. Maybe there is a story out there about a similar haunting in that region that just didn't gain the same notoriety. Anyways, John replied to the witch saying, "Wherever you have been, or whatever you are, your proper place is in hell, and the next visit you make, you should go there and stay," making it very clear that he still held the same hatred for the witch as he did 7 years earlier. Now, after a short back and forth about how John Jr. believed the witch to be an evil demon spirit, and her telling him that all it did was for the greater good for some future generation and so on, as they had spoken about before, the witch told John Jr. that it would leave him alone for the night, and asked him to think on the things they had discussed, and told John Jr. that it would pass on to him all of the knowledge it had. The next evening, the witch would visit John Jr. again, and they spoke quite a bit. And I mean, like 12 pages of conversation. I'm not reading all that to you. You don't want me to read all that to you. But I will provide you with the most interesting things that were said. First of all, on the first night before she left, the witch told of the history of the continent of Africa. She told him that she had known of Africa millions of years ago, and that parts of the land now covered by jungle and parts of the Sahara Desert were once inhabited by a race of people superior to any the world had before or since known. She says they thrived for thousands of years until eventually falling to vice, corruption, and cruelty, ultimately leading to their destruction. She said that after their destruction, there remained not a vestige of human life there for thousands of years. She went on to tell him that 10,000 years ago, Egypt developed a civilization that was far superior to that of the United States, saying the Carthage and a few others had attained a high degree of civilization, no account of which is in your histories. This was long before your histories began. She then told John Jr. of a great war that was to come to the United States, a war that would result in the abolishment of slavery and the freedom of the African people. Obviously, she's talking about the American Civil War that would happen 33 years from then in 1861. She told John Jr. that he would partake in this war at the battle in New Orleans, and that just after that battle he would depart from this world. John Jr.'s only response to this foretelling of his death was that he would like to depart right now if there was any prospect of the witch remaining much longer. She then discussed John Jr.'s previous victory in war against the British, which just so happened to have also taken place in New Orleans. But the Civil War was not the only war the witch predicted. She also told John Jr. that the United States would participate in other wars in his time, but none would be very serious until the Great War, which will likely involve nearly the whole world. She said the United States at that time will have become one of the world's greatest nations, and therefore will be drawn into this terrible struggle. Of course, the war she's speaking of is the First World War. But it doesn't end there. The witch said, quote, "For some time after this great war, there will be threats and signs of another great upheaval, which, if it comes, will be far more devastating and fearful in character than the one the world thought too terrible for the mind to grasp." Of course, she is speaking of World War II. So yes, according to the supposed accounts of John Jr., told to his son Joel Thomas Bell and passed on to his grandson, not only did the witch predict the American Civil War, but also both of the World Wars. But she goes even farther than that in her predictions. The witch says that the United States, just as the Roman government, would fall due to greed and the rich oppressing the poor. She states that eventually, just like the Romans, all laws would be for the benefit of the rich, and the citizens of the country would only be made up of the rich and their slaves. Most importantly, however, she tells John that under Roman rule, the followers of Christ were persecuted, and then the Roman government came to an end, implying that this was no coincidence and that the United States would share in that fate if its course was not changed. But perhaps the most dire prophecy she gave to John Jr. was one that spoke of the end of the world. She says that the people of this world must not forget that this world will surely come to an end, and that if scientists will dig under the right parts of the Earth's surface, they will find remains of destroyed civilization from hundreds of thousands of years ago. She said that the world can be destroyed by its creator at any time, or by any means he chooses, and that the mere knowledge of that should bring a world of sinners to their knees. She told John Jr. its destruction can be complete within a few minutes, and that the end will come at a time when the people of this world are thinking of it the least. But here's a quote I found particularly interesting. Worlds many times larger than this have been destroyed so suddenly that it was only like a powder pan flash, implying that this spirit has witnessed God destroying other worlds outside of our own. John Jr. also told his son that he had asked the witch if there are other worlds besides our own where people exist, and she said that there are other worlds inhabited by people who have undergone similar trials to our own. Some of these, as stated, had been destroyed. Basically, the witch here is confirming the existence of life on other planets. Anyways, she goes on to say that she is not telling John Jr. this simply because it speaks about the end of days in scripture, but rather because it is something she has seen time and time again. She states that the world is not worth destroying yet because the present population does not compare intellectually or otherwise with that of others long ago destroyed. She says that only when the world has become so enlightened that there are no more inventions worth having, the poor become helpless and starving, the rich thinking only of themselves, and suffering becomes so widespread over the world, the Creator will no longer permit it and prepare for the end. When this world is destroyed again, it would seem that it would be complete destruction and never again be habitable. The next evening, she furthers this discussion by saying that eventually, mankind will feel satisfied with their scientific conclusions, and that the concept of having been created by God will be reasoned out. Another interesting prophecy she tells John Jr. is that future generations will live far longer than their ancestors, including those of Bible times. Now yes, we do already live longer than our ancestors due to modern medical science. However, how insane this prophecy is really depends on which people in the Bible she is referring to. If she means the New Testament, then yeah, that prophecy has already come true. However, in the Old Testament, there are people mentioned to have lived multiple hundreds of years, far beyond our current natural lifespan. She told John Jr. that America was inhabited millions of years before your people ever heard of it, by a superior race that was destroyed and succeeded by others, claiming that they had great buildings and schools and machinery, and that our world would also acquire these things before it was destroyed. She describes how this great civilization was destroyed with a shaking of the earth, so violent that it changed the landscape itself, drying out areas that were once ocean, and turning into ocean areas that were once great valleys. The final prediction given by the witch is the one I find the most compelling because of the age of the information in the book. The other predictions could have very well been made up and written after these wars and events had taken place to make it appear as though the witch had this incredible foresight. But this last prediction is something that has only been increasingly worrisome in more recent years, after this book would have been published. The witch apparently told John Jr. that one day the world would become too hot for human beings to exist, and that the heat would increase so rapidly that it would become unpreventable. She seems to be speaking here about global warming. The amount of forest fires and droughts seem to be getting worse with every year, and summers just seem to get hotter and hotter. So, like I said, even if the other predictions were told by the author after they had happened, we are only more recently witnessing the events of the last prediction, which is a bit strange, although it's not like the idea of global warming is necessarily that new. But still, it being something that has yet to be fully realized makes this particular prediction a bit creepier. But it's worse. She also claims that after this increase of heat, the world would be destroyed by a mighty explosion. Global warming obviously won't cause the Earth to explode, but when I read mighty explosion, my first thought was nuclear war. So will the heating of the earth eventually cause tensions to be so great and resources to be so scarce that mankind will be led into nuclear war? I don't know. Stay tuned, I guess. Anyways, besides this, she pretty much just goes on about how people will stop believing in God and Jesus, and how the downfall of man will be our gradual turning away from our religious beliefs and whatnot. None of which is as interesting as the prophecies I've already relayed, so let's move on. The witch actually stayed with John Jr. for several months having these discussions with him, but eventually it told him that it was going to leave the next night. Frank Miles, who was mentioned earlier as a close friend of John Jr.'s and the Bell family, was invited by John Jr. to be present when the witch appeared for the final time. And so it would, somewhat ironically, be the two men that hated the spirit the most that would end up being the ones to hear its final farewell. She told the two of them that she would return again in 7 years, but that this time another 100 years would be added, meaning that she would return again in 107 years, which would be in 1935. She also told John Jr. that she would never again disturb a member of the Bell family, but that she would make herself known to some select few descendants in the future. However, despite 1935 coming and going, this conversation in 1828 would be the last reported encounter with the Bell Witch. Lucy Bell died not too long after that, and the house was deserted and used to store grain. The family divided the rest of the property up amongst themselves, and eventually the old Bell home was torn down. For many years later, however, people still claimed to occasionally see flickering lights on the property and hear distant singing voices, as well as some other strange occurrences believed to be in relation to the witch's lingering presence. It's also worth noting that while most of the family moved away with their loved ones to other counties, Esther and Jesse moving their families to Panola County, Mississippi specifically, Drew Bell actually purchased his own farm on the north side of Red River opposite of his father's, where he led a lonely life for the rest of his days, never marrying or having children. He apparently lived in constant fear of the witch's return, and never mentally recovered from the hauntings or from his father's death at the hands of the spirit. It's said that he would tell his friends of strange noises and occurrences on his property, and believed that the spirit was always present there. Out of his fear, he actually hired a man to keep him company at the house. In the 1850s, some 30 years after the witch's first disappearance, a doctor by the name of Henry Sugg had his own unexplainable experience. You see, Dr. Sugg grew up in the Red River area, but was just a young boy during the witch's time at the Bell farm. He had not witnessed any of the events himself, and he never believed any of the stories told to him by the older folk at the time. He was quite skeptical of it all, and would make his position on it known whenever the subject was brought up. According to his account, after the Bell house was torn down, Joel Bell had relocated to a farmhouse somewhere near a place called Brown's Ford. In the early 1850s, Dr. Sugg was apparently called to this house to treat a patient. While he was there, the subject of the Bell Witch came up, and the man he was treating told him of strange noises and, quote, ridiculous things that had happened the night before, and that he was sure it was the Bell Witch. Dr. Sugg laughed at the man and told him that it was all his imagination, that the Bell Witch was just a hoax and that there was never any truth to it. Just as he said this, they heard a strange noise. It was the rattling of the vials in Dr. Sugg's medicine bag that sat on the floor next to the door. This sound was followed by the sound of an explosion from within the bag, as if all the medicine vials had burst open. Dr. Sugg immediately checked the bag to see what had happened, but found that everything was still intact. He tried to explain it away as something logical to the man in bed. However, while he was attempting to rationalize it, the noises happened again, this time with more force. He examined the bag a second time, and again found that there was nothing broken or out of place. Dr. Sugg was completely baffled by this event, and was never able to come up with an explanation for it. Now, the farm this occurred on was sold by Joel Bell to his brother Richard in 1861, and when Richard eventually passed away, the farm was passed down to his son, Alan Bell. One night, Alan was staying at the farm after recovering from a sickness that caused him to be discharged from the army. Staying with him was his friend Reynolds Powell. That night, when the two men retired to their beds, Alan's dog began to bark and growl in a frightened way, as if it felt threatened by something nearby. The men got out of bed to see what it was, but found nothing unusual, so they put the dog outside and returned to bed. All was quiet for about an hour, until suddenly the pillows were removed from under their heads, and the sheets pulled from under them. Yes, the very same disturbance experienced by the Bell family on many occasions. They got up to investigate again, but could find nothing out of the ordinary, and no explanation for what had just happened. They decided to bolt the doors and return to bed. After another short while, it happened again. The pillows and sheets were violently ripped from underneath them. They once again fixed their beds, but this time held on to their pillows in an effort to keep them from being pulled away. However, they were not strong enough, and the pillows were once again snatched from them, and this time thrown on top of their heads. This would be the last time the strange disturbance occurred, but the two men got very little sleep for the rest of the night. It was likely obvious to both of them that such a thing could have been nothing other than the Bell Witch. There are also a few occasions of people hearing music around the Bell property described as being a volume of symphony vibrating the air, some sort of sweet melody that would almost put people into a trance. This music was heard in 1866 by John Gunn and A.L. Bartlett, after crossing the river on the south side of the old Bell property. They landed near what was known as the Enchanted Spring, the area in which the witch had lied about burying a treasure there many years earlier. The two men, while walking up a hill after refreshing themselves in the spring, suddenly heard the beautiful melodies, and they had both stopped to listen for about 30 minutes until it stopped. Later, in 1872, two young ladies heard the same sort of hypnotizing melody, just a few miles from the Bell property. In 1875, there was a murder in Red River of a man only known as Smith. Smith came into the community as a complete stranger, having no friends or family that lived there. He was employed on a farm by one Mr. Fletcher, and he would boast about how he was something of a wizard with the power to hypnotize and lay spells on people that would subject anyone who came under his influence to his will. He claimed to have derived this power from the mantle of the Bell Witch. Smith was murdered by two men that worked on the same farm he did, a Thomas Clinard and a Richard Burgess. During their trial, the defense apparently provided overwhelming evidence that Smith had practiced hypnotism on the defendants and had them completely under his control, practicing on their fears with dire threats and making them do many foolish things that they detested. It was claimed that the two men were unable to escape Smith's influence. Eventually, they had enough and planned his murder. The two men shot him to death and then turned themselves into the authorities, claiming self-defense. And, get this, they were cleared of their crimes. Their lawyer had actually convinced the jury that this man had been controlling Thomas and Richard with magic derived from the Bell Witch, and that they were indeed acting in self-defense. That, however, is the last notable instance of anything major occurring in relation to the Bell Witch, with no return in 1935 as she promised. Over the course of 5 years, the witch and her demonstrations were witnessed by hundreds of people. Those people went on to tell the next generation about the haunting, and so on, thus creating the legend of the Bell Witch. Richard Bell kept a journal of the events, and 26 years later, in 1846, he used that journal to write a book called Our Family Trouble, in which he gives his first-hand account of the incident. Much of the stories I've shared with you today come directly from Richard's eyewitness account. In 1894, a writer by the name of M.V. Ingram, who was raised just a few miles from the Bell farm, compiled all the historical data from the event, including the eyewitness account of Richard Bell, given to Ingram by Richard's son Alan Bell, into a book called An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch. A descendant of the Bell family, Charles Bailey Bell, who was the grandson of John Bell Jr., also compiled a similar book called A Mysterious Spirit, the Bell Witch of Tennessee, containing information passed down to him from his father, J.T. Bell, who was given first-hand accounts from his father John Bell Jr., and also stories passed to him directly from his great-aunt Betsy Bell when she was 83 years old. He recounts that the Bell family was actually very reluctant to speak about the events, especially to anyone outside of the family, stating that the name Bell Witch was very resented by the family, and that they were quite upset with Richard Bell when he published his journal. Anyways, these two books are often referred to as the Red Book and the Black Book, and are honestly the only source of information I would trust as being somewhat legitimate if you are interested in reading more about the Bell Witch. However, I believe I would not be doing my due diligence if I did not bring up the possibility that author M.V. Ingram completely fabricated the entire legend. Let me explain. So, while the legend of the Bell Witch at this point is very widespread and even believed by many people to have actually taken place, there are a few problems with it. The main issue is that researchers have been unable to verify any report of the Bell Witch that predates M.V. Ingram's work, with the exception of one brief mention in Albert Goodspeed's History of Tennessee in 1886. In this, the Bell Witch legend is mentioned in a short paragraph talking about some remarkable occurrence at the Bell Farm, known as the Bell Witch, which attracted widespread attention. The only details given are that it was some sort of spiritual being with the voice and attributes of a woman, but invisible to the eye, and briefly lists some disturbances it caused as mentioned throughout the video. However, researchers also believe that this paragraph was inserted by Ingram himself to promote his upcoming work, although I've personally yet to see any evidence of this. Outside of that though, there are no newspaper articles on the hauntings, no journals, no public records, nothing. Which is odd considering how widely known and talked about this phenomenon is made out to be in Ingram's writings. So widely known that even the soon-to-be President of the United States had visited, yet there are no real records of this trip anywhere, not even in Jackson's personal journals. Surely if he had witnessed such an extraordinary thing, it would be in his journals. Not even Richard Bell's journal has been confirmed as authentic. In fact, the journal, which according to Ingram is the basis of his work, has never been seen by anyone. It is believed by some researchers that Ingram had taken historical events, people, and maybe even some superstitions from the area at the time, and spun a tale around it in order to sort of blur the lines between fact and fiction, and of course to sell copies of his book. Another thing I find rather suspicious about Ingram's supposed historical accounts is how incredibly detailed his descriptions of things are, and that some of the stories include entire conversations between characters, as if he had been there to witness it himself. In that sense, a lot of the stories do read like a fictional novel of his own creation. It's as though, like I said, he had historical information and expanded upon it using his own imagination. Which also brings into question how much of the stories are fact, and how much of it is just fluff added by Ingram. In the early 2000s, a man named Phil Norfleet did extensive research on the Bell family and the legend, tracing the Bell family history through federal census, reports, deeds, wills, court minutes, and church records in an attempt to test it against Ingram's story. First of all, John Bell's father is stated by Ingram to be a William Bell, and that he was from North Carolina. According to Norfleet's research, he only found one William Bell in that area during the time frame that matches up with Ingram's history. The record in question is actually William Bell's will, in which he mentions his sons Arthur and Joshua and daughters Mary and Anne, no John. This will is dated 1754, and Ingram claims that John Bell was born in 1750. Now, jump to 1773, we have records of a John Bell in North Carolina, but in a different county, purchasing farmland which is never mentioned by Ingram. But there is a very interesting will of a man named John Williams from 1793. John Williams is stated to be the father of Lucy Bell. In his will, his children are listed as such: Betsy, Mary, Milbury, Nancy, Lucy, Benjamin, Jesse, Drew, and John Jr., which is odd because that is suspiciously close to the family of John Bell and Lucy. Did John and Lucy name their kids after all of Lucy's brothers and sisters? Possible, I suppose, but a bit strange. It's also likely, however, that Ingram used these family records to create his story. Now, we do have confirmation in Northfleet's research of a John Bell selling property in North Carolina in 1803, which would have been around the time his family relocated to Red River according to the legends. It also confirms that in 1805, John Bell received membership to the Red River Baptist Church. There is a deed confirming his acquisition of a 220-acre tract of farmland on the south side of Red River, and later 100 more acres of land. It is confirmed that John Bell had died around the end of 1820, as per court minutes from February 1821, showing that John Bell Jr. had been appointed administrator of the estate. It is confirmed that the Bell family did have slaves named Dean, Harry, and Phyllis, among others, as shown in the Robertson County Will Book. Most of this information seems to confirm that there are at least some details of the Bell Witch legend, or at least of the Bell family, that are fact. However, I would like to draw attention to the farmland purchased by John Bell. You see, in Ingram's writings, he claims that the Bell family lived on a 1,000-acre farm. All official records state it to have only been 320 acres. But this is more complicated than Ingram simply exaggerating acreage. The typical land grant there at the time was usually about 640 acres. In 1783, the Military Reservation Act offered privates who served in the American Revolution 640 acres. Prior to these grants, settlers were offered grants where they could claim 640 acres if they could prove they had cultivated the land. The fact that records indicate John Bell to only have 320 acres, which was relatively small, means that they were ineligible for a military grant, and also short on wealth. Not quite the picture painted by Ingram, with John Bell having 1,000 acres and being one of the wealthiest farmers in the area. In fact, according to Ingram's tales, John Bell was not only wealthy, but very influential in the community of Red River, and historical records just don't indicate this at all. Historical records from Albert Goodspeed's History of Tennessee contain lists of dignitaries, officials, politicians, and other notable people that contributed to the Robertson County area. And guess what? John Bell isn't mentioned anywhere. Essentially, outside of M.V. Ingram's work in 1894, which has inconsistencies in its historical facts and accounts that cannot be verified at all, and the small excerpt in Albert Goodspeed's History of Tennessee, the Bell Witch legend isn't documented anywhere, suggesting that, while implied by Goodspeed's mention of it, there may have been some campfire story superstition passed on in the area, the large majority of the legend was made up by Ingram, who simply loosely based it off some historical fact. Anyways, that aside, I did my best here today to provide you with pretty much every piece of information related to the Bell Witch legend, either in full or in passing. But obviously I couldn't go into full excruciating detail on every occurrence of the hauntings. And there are a few sort of insignificant stories I couldn't really find a good place to insert into the video, such as the witch laughing at Thenny Thorn for bringing a 4-leaf clover to the property, with the hopes that it would allow her to see the witch, or the witch spanking the baby of John and Patsy Johnson, or the witch providing information that led to the arrest of 2 horse thieves, and other random little tales like that. So if you would like to read more on it, I highly suggest picking up this book by Nick Moretti, titled The Bell Witch Anthology. This book collects the writings of Richard Bell, Charles Bell, and M.V. Ingram into one book. So it's basically the Bell Witch Bible. You can also actually visit the site of the Bell Witch hauntings today. It's a 40-minute drive from Nashville to Adams, where you can actually take a tour of the Bell Witch Cave and the Bell Home, which has been reconstructed. They have artifacts from the original home, including chimney stone and an iron kettle, as well as news articles and photos from the time period in which the Bell family resided there. I will leave a link to the tour website in the description in case you wanted to check it out. Now, as much as I would like to debunk the stories I told you today without a single shred of doubt, I can't. As I said, the events took place some 200 years ago. And outside of Richard's journal, if you choose to believe he had a journal, most of the stories were all passed down by word of mouth from the family and the many people that visited the Bell farm at the time. And that's if you believe the testimonies in M.V. Ingram's work to be authentic. But I'll let you decide what to make of all this. Much of it doesn't sound believable, sure, but there is just no way to outright prove or disprove any of the stories. So what do you think? Was it all a hoax, or was the Bell family truly tormented by some spirit or demon they called the Bell Witch? I'll let you sleep on it. Good night.